Hello again, welcome to our third video in the language of anatomy. This video discusses the major body cavities. So body cavities are going to be spaces, usually fluid-filled spaces within the body. There are actually a lot of these spaces, some of them small, some of them large. So like a good example would be of small cavities would be what are called synovial cavities. These are cavities inside all of your synovial joints. Like in your knee and in your shoulder and in your fingers. So these are minor body cavities, but what we're going to look at here are some of these larger major body cavities. Okay. So the first of these larger major body cavities is going to be what's called the dorsal cavity. So the dorsal body cavity is what you can see here in yellow. Okay, so let's put a little check mark inside there. So that entire cavity there that's in yellow is the dorsal body cavity. Now the dorsal body cavity is going to be made up, or is going to contain, two smaller cavities. Okay, the first one is called the cranial cavity, which is inside your skull, and that cavity is going to contain the brain. The second smaller cavity inside the dorsal cavity is called the vertebral cavity. The vertebral cavity is going to be this section of yellow here that's inside the spine or inside the vertebrae. And this vertebral cavity is going to be important because it contains the spinal cord. Okay. The second large body cavity is called the ventral body cavity. Now you guys just learned in a slideshow not too long ago what dorsal and ventral means. Remember that dorsal means closer to the spine. Ventral means closer to the belly. So the ventral body cavity is going to be this sort of body cavity that you have here in the belly region of the body. Now the ventral body cavity is going to contain a number of smaller cavities within it. The two major cavities that you're going to find inside the dorsal body cavity are going to be the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now these two cavities are separated from each other by a dome-shaped muscle under the rib cage called the diaphragm. Okay, the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is going to sort of make this major separation, this upper cavity and then this lower cavity. Okay, so the upper cavity is thoracic. The lower cavity is abdominal pelvic. Okay. Now, in the thoracic cavity, you're going to have a lot of smaller cavities inside the thoracic cavity. Okay. So the first two are going to be the cavities for the lungs. These are called the pleural cavities. So you're going to have a right one here and a left one here. Okay, so you have a right and left pleural cavities. Now there's going to be a small space, a small cavity between them here, right here, called the mediastinum. Okay, the mediastinum or mediastinum, however you want to pronounce it, as long as you can spell it. Okay. Now that mediastinum is going to be kind of important. It's going to contain some major blood vessels, some major airway vessels, and some other important things like the thymus, and a number of important things. Now, one of the other things that's kind of important about the mediastinum is there's going to be a third cavity, or I should say a fourth cavity, inside the mediastinum. That cavity is going to be for the heart. So that cavity is called the pericardial cavity, which you can sort of see here. Okay. Next is the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now this one's much easier because the abdominal pelvic cavity is going to have sort of two smaller cavities within it. The first being the abdominal cavity, which is going to be most of this abdominal pelvic cavity. So everything above sort of the entrance to the pelvis. And what you guys will learn when we talk about bones as the pelvic inlet. Everything above the pelvic inlet is the abdominal cavity. Now inside the pelvis, you've got this kind of little bowl. Once you get past that pelvic inlet, that little bowl inside the pelvis is going to be the pelvic cavity. Now, the abdominal cavity is kind of an important one because this contains most of your internal organs, your digestive organs, your kidneys, and all kinds of important things. The pelvic cavity is we have a flow chart for those of you who are visual that will kind of walk you through what we just talked about in the picture. So remember that inside the ventral body cavity, kind of imagine the ventral body cavity like a box. And inside this box, you have a bunch of smaller boxes. Okay, so inside this big box, which is the ventral cavity, you've got your thoracic cavity and your abdominal pelvic cavity. I apologize for that not being perfect. Right? Now notice that the flow chart here tells you that these two are separated by the diaphragm. Now inside the thoracic cavity, you'll see that you have your pleural cavities like I showed you, left and right. In between them, you have the mediastinum. Also, what's nice about this flow chart is it tells you what these cavities contain, and you should pay attention to that. Inside the mediastinum, you have the pericardial cavity, which will surround the heart. In the flow chart, it shows you that the abdominal pelvic cavity can be divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, and then it shows you what these two cavities contain here. Okay. So I hope this video helps, and I'll talk to you soon.